Now, welcome everyone to the Just Economy podcast, sponsored by the Community Reinvestment Alliance of Florida. We are a statewide member organization, a nonprofit that ensures that the banks provide low to moderate income and the community at large through the Community Reinvestment Act of 1977. We can foster partnerships, collaborations, ensuring that the nonprofits that are serving our community partner with the banks and making our community better. Again, our motto is building Florida's just economy, $1, one vote at a time. We have some exciting things besides our guest today. We have some exciting things coming up. Put this on your calendar. February 23rd will be our annual summit. It will be Summit 23, our sixth summit since our existence. Again, we'll be doing that February 23rd. We got some big things coming up with some great guests, great keynote speakers, and I'm going to feed you. So lunch and dinner, a correction of breakfast and lunch. So it will be a full, as we used to say when I was in the Army, a full training day. So we look forward to that. Not to mention we have some in the next quarter, we'll be having some trainings concerning the Community Reinvestment Act. We're going to invite some guests on to talk about what they do. But today we have a great guest from an organization that you probably don't know about. They are more unknown than some of the most secretive organizations in our government, but they're a big part of it. They play a great big part of what the banks are required to do and what we do in the community as a whole. And I'll be glad to share with you today that we have from the Federal Reserve, Mr. Mike Chriszt, and he's going to be our guest today. And we're going to talk about what things happen, the things that the Federal Reserve does, how they regulate, how they help the banks invest in the community, and how they help the community overall. Some things that you definitely must know. And all these agencies, I know we get caught up in the alphabet soup of the different agencies, but they're vital to our existence. They're vital to the nonprofit's mission. They're vital to the community moving forward. So Mike is here and he's going to talk about what the Federal Reserve does. You know, we always have a tendency to call it the Fed or the Fed Reserve, or, you know, we hardly ever say their whole name, but I get to actually say the whole name today, the United States Federal Reserve, Southeast region. So we welcome Mike Chriszt. How you doing, Mike?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Great. You are one of my big gets. You know, this has been getting someone from from the government agencies that help regulate the banks is crucial for the community to know. So you are one of my all my guests have been great, but you are one of my special gets. I was so glad that you were able to make it and say yes. But Mike, before we get started and deep into the questioning, tell us a little bit about you and how you came. I'm always interested in people's history. So how
Sure.
Tell us a little bit about you and how you came to work for the Fed.
All right. So I've been with the Federal Reserve for the Federal Reserve Bank in Atlanta for 33 years. I'm originally from Cleveland, Ohio. And I came to the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, and this is going to date me, but I answered a want ad in the newspaper.
Oh, cool. In the actual newspaper,
my wife,
not online, but in the actual newspaper. Gotcha.
I wish I would have kept it, but yeah. So my wife and I met in school, and her first job was in Atlanta. My first job was in Washington. And the agreement was whoever career was off to a better start, the other person would move. So she was off to a flying start. Washington's a tough town to break into. So I quit my job in Washington, moved here, and like I said, was fortunate enough to find that ad in the paper and blessed enough to start my career at the Atlanta Fed back in 1989.
Oh, wow. Great. Well, we're glad to have you again. Like I said, you're one of my major gets this year. My board is going to be so impressed that I was able to get someone for the Federal Reserve to be on our podcast. We greatly appreciate you. So let's jump right in. So can you give me a little bit of history of the Atlanta Fed?
Sure. Absolutely. So I'll start with a question, if that's okay. Have you seen the musical Hamilton?
Yes, I have.
Okay, so there's a part in there where Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson are having a debate about the future of what the financial system of our new country was going to look like. Mm-hmm. And Hamilton favored a very strong central government with a central authority to help manage the financial system. Jefferson thought otherwise. And this debate was happening in real life in the 1790s, right after we became a country. And the Hamilton's view won out. And what was created from that was the first Bank of the United States, which you've probably never heard of. If you've been to Philadelphia, the building's still there.
Oh, okay.
But it was only chartered for 20 years. And at the end of that 20 years, the politics in the country had shifted. Mm-hmm. And those who favored Thomas Jefferson's view of a weak central government and weak central authority chose not to renew the charter of the first Bank of the United States. So the Federal Reserve, as we know it today, is the central bank of the United States. The first bank of the United States that I just described was really our country's first attempt to have a central bank.
Oh, okay.
And it didn't work, or it didn't get enough support. Mm-hmm. Probably a little bit more history than you're interested in, but I think it's important. So I'm going to go forward just a little bit.
By all means.
And after the War of 1812, the country's finances were in a shambles once again. And that debate between those who had Hamilton's view and those who had Jefferson's view happened again. Mm-hmm. And Hamilton's view won out for the second time, and the second Bank of the United States was created. The building is still there in Philadelphia as well, just behind Independence Hall, if you're ever in that area.
Yeah, next time I go to Philly, I want to check out both of these buildings you're talking about.
It's really fascinating. I think it's an art museum now.
Oh, cool.
Well, yeah, I kind of fast forwarded because if it's not a central bank anymore, it's an art museum. You know that it didn't work either. Mm-hmm. So it was chartered for 20 years, and at the end of that 20 years, Andrew Jackson was president of the United States, and he did not favor the Hamilton view. Actually, I believe he referred to the second Bank of the United States as a den of vipers and thieves.
Wow.
So its charter was not renewed. And so the second Bank of the United States ceased to exist. So we had two failed experiments at central banking in this country. Mm-hmm. So Cornell, fast forward to the 1890s, early 1900s, our country was industrializing quite rapidly. The financial system really wasn't keeping up with the needs of our growing economy. And that debate that started back with Hamilton and Jefferson, that was so wonderfully described in the musical, came to be again. Wow. And this time, rather than favoring one view over the other, they came up with a compromise where a central bank would be created that would have a strong central authority that is today known as the Board of Governors in Washington, D.C., mm-hmm. but would also have a dispersed power structure. So all parts of the country were represented. And those we know today as the 12 reserve banks throughout the country, Atlanta being one of them. Mm-hmm. So the Federal Reserve Act was passed in 1913. The Fed, as we know it today, came into existence the year after. And interestingly enough, Atlanta was chosen as one of the regional banks. And the first branch of a regional bank was in New Orleans. There was quite a debate whether or not the Southeast regional bank would be in Atlanta and New Orleans. Atlanta won. And so New Orleans was the first branch of the ever created in the Federal Reserve System. Okay. And a piece of trivia, and I'll stop after this, but the last branch that was created is in Miami. Really? So the Miami branch of the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta was created in 1975. And that was mainly because of the increasing and still very high use of the U.S. dollar as currency in South and Central America.
Gotcha. Okay.
So there's a lot of currency, flowing through the Miami branch. So 1975, we had the first branch in New Orleans and the last branch in Miami.
I'll bet you there are very few people that know that we have a branch. I've been to it several times. I bet you there are very few people in South Florida that know we have a branch of the Federal Reserve in Miami. Yeah. It's highly secured. You have to go through a gate and be checked. Your car has to be checked. You have to provide IDs, all that good stuff in order to get in it. But it's an amazing building. And like I said, probably very few people know, and it's located down near Kendall, between Kendall and South Miami, in that area there. It's if you ever get a chance to go to a tour, I advise all our listeners, if you ever get a chance to do a tour of the Federal Reserve in Miami, by all means, please do so. So, Mike, thank you very much for that history. A lot of the stuff I didn't know, and I pride myself on trying to read everything. But my goal in life is to know everything there is to know. So I'll never stop learning. So thank you very much for that history lesson. So, can you give us a little bit on how the Federal Reserve does regulation? What is their overall job as far as regulating our banking system?
Sure. So the Federal Reserve is one of several regulatory agencies in the United States. There's, the FDIC and the OCC as well. We have authority given to us by Congress to oversee, if you will, the activities of banks that are known as state member banks. They are members of the Federal Reserve System, and a bank can opt to become a member. That's completely up to them. But when they do, they submit themselves to regulation from our staff. That we have many people in Atlanta, and also a large contingent of supervisors in the Miami area as well. Cornell, I don't want to sound like the Federal Reserve we tell banks what to do. That's not how we look at it. We look at it as a partnership with the financial institutions that we regulate. Our staff works really hard with them and other regulatory agencies for larger issues like the CRA, for example, to help institutions really serve the public as best they can, to follow the rules that have been laid out, and through those activities and through different tools that we have, really try to make the financial system as a whole as safe and as sound as possible.
Yeah, and I've always looked at it, well, especially since I've been in this job and got really involved in the Community Reinvestment Act, that it's been a partnership. And it's interesting that you say that they don't necessarily have to register with the Federal Reserve or any of the agencies, correct? But if they want to be insured, they have to register with one of the three agencies. Am I right?
That's correct. And to take a step back, it's one thing that we learned in the financial crisis in 2008, 2009 was we being the Federal Reserve and other regulatory agencies were really good at supervising individual institutions, but taking a step back and seeing the financial system as a whole, there were things that everybody missed. And those things created such havoc, as everybody knows, and your listeners, many of them I'm sure lived through that, where the financial system was really in dire straits.
Sure.
So one of the lessons coming out of that was to not just regulate institutions, but look at the financial system as a whole. And that includes looking at non-bank institutions and to see if there's any systemic risk posed by any activities or any events that happen that could pose that kind of risk. So we don't have a repeat of that kind of financial crisis that we did 15 years ago.
Yeah, that was ugly. And, some people are still feeling the effects of it today. I want to switch up a little bit and talk about the Community Reinvestment Act and the role of the Federal Reserve in the Community Reinvestment Act. As you well know, we're working on significant change to the first significant change to the Community Reinvestment Act since 1995, which for me is amazing. But, we did a lot of comment letters. We encouraged our listeners and the nonprofits to submit comment letters. Our comment letter for our organization was 4 pages. We talked about a wide variety of things and hoping to boost scoring, boost investment, and boost how the banks are scored on their regulatory exams. So Can you give us a little bit about how the Federal Reserve plays into the Community Reinvestment Act, and how that's done as far as dealing with the banks and investment in the community?
Sure. So it's one of the things that our regulators look at when they examine financial institutions. Are they abiding by the law, the CRA law? And you mentioned that it's under review right now. I believe the time to comment is closed.
Yes, it has.
But all those comments are being evaluated by the Federal Reserve Board, the FDIC, and the OCC. And with those comments, they will modernize the CRA. And like you said, I mean, I too was I shouldn't say I was shocked, because I work for the Federal Reserve and we don't ever want to say we're shocked by anything, but it was long overdue. Yeah. And I think that the fact that all three agencies got together to conduct that review, and that the input from the public was not just welcome, but really needed to make sure that, any changes would incorporate views from organizations like yourself and the views of the financial institutions as well, to make sure that, again, the CRA does what it was intended to do, which is, as you know, make sure financial institutions invest in the communities in which they're located and serve.
That's a key element to building a just economy. I think in trying to make things equal, so that everybody has the same opportunities. Everybody's not going to receive the same benefits, but we at least want the same opportunities. And I think, like the Federal Reserve and the OCC stands for the Office of Controller of Currency, and then the FDIC. All three of the government agencies, without your regulatory oversight, I believe we'd be in much more dire straits than we have. And as you stated, we haven't changed the law since 1995. The law was enacted in 1977. And then there's been no significant change since 1995, and we've done some things we've made comments on some of the agencies you're talking about, those that are non-banking, that are doing, in quotation marks, banking work in our communities, providing loans, mortgage loans, and business loans, and all those things, doing basically what banks do, but are not regulated by any of the agencies. And we have a tendency, or we have noticed that they have a tendency to run a little bit of amok. So it's important that, I know a lot of comments by the nonprofits were made were, okay, we would love to have the regulatory agencies be able to regulate those folks who are performing banking functions, but are not, or considered non-banks, and therefore, kind of being able to get away with some things that the banks are not being able to get away with. So you guys are very, very important, and we're hoping that some of the suggestions that we made come to fruition. So I wanted to, you mentioned the regulators from the Federal Reserve. Could you talk to us a little bit more about the regulators and how they regulate the exams?
Well, I'm getting a little bit out of my area of expertise, Cornell, so I don't want to go into details that I've never participated in an exam. I will tell you that the amount of information that they use in developing an exam, current market conditions in which the bank that they're reviewing operates, and the ongoing conversations with the financial institutions are part of what they do. It's something you mentioned a second ago, spurred another thought about how important the CRA is to making sure that we are having you refer to it as a just economy. One of the things that we refer to at the Atlanta Fed is, we call it everyone's economy.
Wow, I like that.
And to make it, part of the Federal Reserve's mission, if you will, is really to promote a stable financial system, which I think we've been talking about, but also more broadly a stable economy. And Congress has given the Fed basically two jobs. One is to promote maximum employment, and the other is to keep inflation low and stable. And when we think about the maximum employment part of that mandate, it's very difficult to say that we're doing we've really achieved that part of the mission just because the unemployment rate is low, or just because like the labor report came out this morning about jobs that were created last month. It was over 300,000, which is a very good number. But really,
I missed the news this morning.
Yeah, it was a very strong report. But we're not going to sit back and say, okay, well, we've been successful there, because we know that there's parts of the economy that aren't working for everybody. We recognize that there's areas within cities and in rural communities that a 3.5% unemployment rate is not anywhere close to what the reality is. And so through our community development activities, we have an economic education program where we promote economic education and financial literacy. I think that's a shared mission that we have with your group.
Yes.
Really try to promote conditions that foster full employment in the truest sense of that word. So everybody that wants a job has the opportunity to get a job. So we interpret that mandate a bit broader than just looking at a couple of statistics from the monthly labor market report. It really is doing things within our authority to promote an economy that is for everybody, where everybody does have that chance to really rise to the level that they choose to rise to.
And I totally agree with you. But you just said something that I would love for you to expound on. The community development arm of the Fed. Could you expound on that for us, please?
Sure. So every reserve bank has a community and economic development team, and in Atlanta, our team has a number of focus areas. One is workforce development. It ties directly into the employment mandate that we just talked about. And let me back up for a second. I mentioned both parts of the mandate. I'll be happy to come back to inflation if you want to, because we got some issues there.
Definitely talk about inflation.
Okay. I don't want you to think I was skimming over that and just talking about the employment side. But workforce development is such an important part of developing a full and successful labor market for the economy. We talked to business contacts throughout the region, and we've heard, going back even during, if you can believe this, during the Great Recession, employers having difficulty finding staff with the skills that they were looking for.
Yeah, that was the common
refrain. So you have a national unemployment rate of 10%, and you hear from businesses that they can't find people. There's something going on there that we need to figure out. So our community development team does a lot of work in workforce development. We partner with other agencies at the state, local, and federal level to try to develop some programs and to share our expertise and knowledge in that area. So that's one focus of our community development team in Atlanta. Another focus is housing. And everybody that knows anything about the economy knows it's very difficult to have a stable career or hold down a job if you don't have
not a roof over your
decent
head.
Housing. It's just impossible. So issues with regard to housing, both at the macroeconomic level and also within communities. Housing issues is another area that our group focuses on. We also pay attention to small businesses and small business development. Those are so crucial to our economy, and sometimes overlooked because they might have 5 to 10 employees, but they're such a generator of long-term employment in our country. They're so important. And we also have experts in community development finance. I think one of them down in Miami that works out of our branch there. Again, to try to understand the financing environment, not just from banks as a whole, but even community development finance institutions or CDFIs.
Wow.
Developing relationships.
So
Yeah.
there's a link between you guys and the Treasury that I didn't know about. Because for those of you who are in our audience who don't know, Treasury is regulates and runs the Community Development Financial Institution program, and you have to go through a lot in order to be a CDFI in this country. But I didn't know that there was an actual link between the Federal Reserve to the Treasury concerning CDFIs. That's an interesting fact. I did not know.
Well, yeah, the link is I mean, there's so many partnerships to make
Mm-hmm.
things successful. And yeah, the program is administered by Treasury, but the relationships that we've developed with CDFIs throughout the region really help us understand some of the challenges that some of these areas face. So the authority does rest with Treasury. We don't have any authority to regulate
Mm-hmm.
or go in and tell CDFIs or what or to grant somebody a license to be a CDFI. But we understand the importance of the roles CDFIs play in really developing, well, community development at the local level. So developing partnerships with them is important to us as well.
So I hope as folks look at this podcast, and I know there are a million other questions that I could ask, but I think what I really want to focus on is how much of a part the Federal Reserve plays in our everyday lives. You talked about jobs and creating jobs. You talked about unemployment. You talked about training those folks who need to be trained in order to produce those or to do those jobs. And you talked about small business and how small business is needed and how you guys try to help with small business items in order to enhance those small businesses, who in turn employ the people. For instance, in the state of Florida, 67% of our businesses are small businesses. Of those 67%, a little over 60% have 10 employees or less. So, because we're a state that doesn't manufacture anything, we don't build anything. Our number one, especially in South Florida, our number one industry is tourism. So, it's just amazing how much we don't know about what the Federal Reserve does. I know you guys constantly do a lot of surveys. I know there's a lot of surveys that are sent out, especially to small businesses, concerning how to make things better for small businesses. So I encourage you, if you're a small business and you're listening to this podcast or watching this podcast, when I send you something that the Federal Reserve is asking for some answers and asking for a survey, I need you to fill it out and get it back to them so they can help us with this issue, because it just goes to show you the ties that we don't understand. Because when I go out and speak about the Federal Reserve and I'm talking to different organizations or talking to our membership, I talk about it. I frame it around the Community Reinvestment Act always, and I got to expound on that now. Because you just taught me something that I didn't know. Although I've seen the surveys and I've passed them forward and stuff, I didn't know that you guys were so intricate in small business, in unemployment, in employment, period. I didn't know that you guys were such an intricate force in those things.
Yeah, it's really, it all goes back to our mandates, really, that Congress has given us. We are deeply involved with talking to businesses and community leaders throughout the region, and in each of our branches. I mentioned the Miami, New Orleans branch. We also have branches in Jacksonville, in Nashville, and in Birmingham. Mm-hmm. And in each of those areas, in each of those offices, and in Atlanta, of course, we have somebody that we call our regional executive. And it's their job to go out and talk to businesses, talk to community leaders, to hear firsthand what their plans are for their business with regard to hiring and prices, the things that directly tie to our mandate, and to really get a feel for, in real time, how the economy is performing. Because we look at all kinds of data, as you can imagine. Mm-hmm. We do all kinds of surveys to find out what people are thinking and planning. And we have incredible economists that run very sophisticated models that try to tell us what's going to happen next. It's really the combination of all those things, Cornell, that gives us the information that we need to, or I should say that President Raphael Bostic needs when he has to make decisions about Federal Reserve monetary policy or interest rate policy. Mm-hmm. So it all comes together really for that main purpose, to make sure that we are doing the job that Congress really I say Congress, but really doing the job that the American people through their elected officials have told us to do. And we can't do it just by looking at data or looking at numbers and looking at forecasts. You have to get out there into the community.
Yeah, got to be boots
Absolutely.
on
You
the
have to
ground.
listen to what people are saying. You're absolutely right.
So let's move on to the biggie that's on everybody's mind these days, and that's inflation. You know, I like to keep it simple. Inflation for me means that prices have gone up. It's costing me more to get the same item that I got 6 months ago, a month ago, a year ago. And so give us a little bit of how the Fed plays in inflationary times, and the amount of inflation and how inflation might be toned down or regulated in this country.
Sure. So like I said, one of the mandates that Congress has given us is low and stable inflation. And the Federal Reserve has defined that as averaging 2% over time. Mm-hmm. So we are well above 2% right now. And there's reasons for that happened. I mean, basically coming out of the pandemic, the economy recovered faster than we expected. And the supply chains and issues with regard to supply persisted much longer and continue to persist. And then there's also, Russia's invasion of Ukraine that had impact on food and energy prices. So there's a number of factors that led to this increase in inflation. I don't say that to say, well, golly, not our fault. It's our job to make sure that inflation stays low. So what we are doing to address that situation is what central banks all around the world do when inflation gets high, and that is increase interest rates to try to, there's not a lot that the Federal Reserve can do about the supply side.
Sure.
We don't control weather. We don't control supply change.
How good
we do have
from one place to another. That's not under your purview.
Yeah, we don't. It's a big enough job for me to drive into the office in Atlanta. So, getting from one place to another, that's not our job. I know the
feeling. I live in Miami.
we can have a whole podcast about that if you want.
Sure.
But we can influence demand. And so demand being as strong as it is and supply not keeping up, if we can raise interest rates to slow the economy down, to bring demand in line with supply, prices should stabilize and start to fall. Mm-hmm. And that is it's not going to happen overnight. The Federal Reserve has what they call the Federal Open Market Committee, or FOMC. Mm-hmm. That's the Board of Governors in Washington, D.C., and the regional bank presidents, which, again, going back to that compromise to make sure that we're getting voices from across the country in policy decisions. They come together every 6 to 8 weeks to decide what monetary policy moves need to be made. And they've been consistently raising interest rates at their meetings to try to bring inflation down.
Yeah, I keep a close eye on those meetings and hang on every word that the Fed chair talks about, that he says. I think the thing, especially in the United States, is people think that, okay, we snap our fingers and that ends it, especially with things like inflation and how inflation has gone. It went up quickly, and like you said, it was exasperated by quite a few things, with the pandemic being the main one. But people actually believe that the Fed could snap their fingers and inflation comes down tomorrow. The price of things will drop in a matter of minutes, and that's just not true. Anybody who's dealt with government knows there's a bureaucracy that goes on, and government, the wheels of government grind kind of slow. But even when you guys do make a decision, or when the Fed chair does make a decision about interest rates, going either driving up interest rates or lowering interest, whatever decision he decides to make takes time in order to get across the board. Correct?
The best way to describe it is it takes time for those decisions to really flow through the economy, mm-hmm. to you and I going out and purchasing a good or a service. Those prices took time the pressure that led to the increase in prices took time to feed through the economy, and it's going to take time to bring it back down again. Mm-hmm. Some of the forecasts that I've seen, it's inflation coming back down to the 2% level by 2024. So it's going to be a while before we get back to our target area. But like you said, it's important that we also look at the other side of our mandate. We don't want to act in such a way, if I'm talking about the Federal Reserve, that really grinds the economy to a halt at the same time just to bring inflation down. So it's that balance. And right now, the balance is very clear. We have to tackle inflation. That has such detrimental effects on the long-term health of the economy. But we also keep an eye on the other side of our mandate. And that's one thing that our president, Raphael Bostic, has talked about several times. And he just posted an essay on our website earlier this week talking about how he's viewing his role in tackling inflation, how seriously he takes it. It's really the only thing we think about in so many different ways, because at its core, the Fed's job is to keep inflation low and stable, and it is high right now, and we need to do what we need to do to act. The American people, through their elected officials, have told us that's what our job is, and we're executing that now.
Well, as a person who votes in every single election and a citizen of this country, I'm telling you that's what you need to do as well. So
absolutely.
So I only have a couple of more questions, and I wanted to, because I know we talk about the Community Reinvestment Act, we talked about inflation, we talk about the work that the Federal Reserve does. So especially in our state, in the state of Florida, and in South Florida in particular, we're known as the gateway to Central and South America. So as we deal with a lot of foreign nations, the Federal Reserve also works with other banks, world banks throughout the world, and as you try to regulate inflation and try to keep inflation to a minimum and try to an overall health of communities. Correct?
Well, there's no formal coordination with regard to monetary policy. Our job is the health of the U.S. economy and the U.S. economy alone. That said, there are things that happen overseas that have a big impact on our economy, and you have to take those into consideration as well. And the United States is not the only country that's facing very high inflation right now. This is a global phenomenon. It was a global pandemic that had impact on global supply chain. So every central bank is dealing with the same issues that the Federal Reserve is dealing with, and trying to bring inflation back down to appropriate levels.
Yeah, I just think it's one of those things that I'm a firm believer that anything in the community and the world is a team game, which means for me, team means I can't do it without you. You can't do it without me. We have to work together in order to make this happen. So it's been such an interesting conversation, because that's one of the reasons I wanted to have you on, because people hear me talk about the Federal Reserve, and there's they see the headlines, the Federal Reserve did this, Federal Reserve does that, and or there's a big announcement, especially concerning inflation, which is on everybody's mind these days. But how much more involved in the community you guys are, and that's one of the things I wanted to bring out, how important that the Federal Reserve is to the community. Because look, we just talked about inflation. We talked about small businesses. We talked about employment. We talked about regulating the financial institutions. All these things come together on the Federal Reserve, and I think a lot of people don't know how important you guys are to the community. So if you wanted to say, if you have last thing that you'd like to say to our community in general about the Federal Reserve, please feel free.
So do we have like an hour? Because there's a lot of things.
No, I don't have an hour. Listen, but
so you said a word at the outset that I wrote down. When people think about the Federal Reserve, they think about the secret organization. That is not where we want to be. We don't see ourselves as being secretive. We want to be open. We want to be transparent. We understand that we are accountable to the American people, and we want to engage. We coming out and speaking to civic groups, sharing whatever information that we have. There's all kinds of really interesting data tools on our website that you don't have to be a PhD in economics to benefit from. And we talked about some of the work that our community development group does to engage in our community. So We don't want to be a secretive organization. We understand that the things that the Federal Reserve is tasked with are sometimes complicated financial things, or
Sure.
economics can be a complicated. If you took a class in school in economics, you understand sometimes it can be very complicated. And part of the reason why is we need to teach it better, because it's really interesting and so important to people's daily lives. But we want to be more open. We want to be more engaging. And I invite your listeners to visit our webpage, look at some of the things that President Bostic has said about his engagement and his deep commitment to improving the communities in the Southeast. And we want to be partners to make sure that we're all working towards that same goal of having an economy that is for everybody.
That's great to hear, Mike, and thank you so much. And I'm going to make sure that you're not a secretive organization, and get your message out and talk about you constantly. Because, like I said, I always used you in the framework of the Community Reinvestment Act, but your involvement in community development, involvement with how inflation runs in this country, and all those things, and are important that the citizens know that there are actually people, that there is organizations, that the United States government is not against everyone. The government is here to help us. And we just got to know more. We got to have more knowledge. So we greatly appreciate Mike Chriszt coming on from the United States Federal Reserve. And you've been a great guest, Mike. Thank you so much. And Mike did it on short notice. I asked on Monday, I think it was, and Mike said, sure, I can come on. And Mike, we greatly appreciate you. Believe me, we're going to invite you to come back and talk some more, because all of this is very interesting and I need to know. So we look forward to having you in the future, and thank you so much for being on, Mike.
Absolutely. We'll do it in person next time.
Yes, we will. We'll bring you down to South Florida, preferably when it's not so hot and no storms hanging out in the Atlantic Basin. So
sounds great to me.
Come down and enjoy. Thank you, Mike. And thank you, everyone. We appreciate you tuning in to the Just Economy podcast, sponsored by the Community Reinvestment Alliance of Florida, a nonprofit membership organization serving the whole state of Florida, building a just economy, $1, one vote at a time, here in Florida. My name is Cornell Cruz Jr. I am the Executive Director of the Community Reinvestment Alliance of Florida, and we look forward to you being a part of our podcast. And again, if you would like to be on our podcast and you have a special message that you want to be, that you want to get out, or you're a community leader or community advocate, we look forward to having you on our podcast. Please feel free to contact me, Cornell. And my email is cornell@reinvestmentalliance.org, or contact Olivia Cantu. That's Olivia C@reinvestmentalliance.org. We thank you very much for tuning into the podcast, and I hope you look forward to the next one. Thank you again, Mike, and we'll be seeing you soon.